Genoa and Its Neighborhood by Charles Dickens. The first impressions of such a place as Albaro, the suburb of Genoa, where I am now, as my American friends would say, located, can hardly fail, I should imagine, to be mournful and disappointing. It requires a little time and use to overcome the feeling of depression consequent, at first, on so much ruin and neglect. Novelty, pleasant to most people, is particularly delightful, I think, to me. I am not easily dispirited when I have the means of pursuing my own fancies and occupations, and I believe I have some natural aptitude for accommodating myself to circumstances. But as yet I stroll about here, in all the holes and corners of the neighborhood, in a perpetual state of forlorn surprise. And returning to my villa, the Villa Bagnarello, it sounds romantic, but Signor Bagnarello is a butcher hard by, have sufficient occupation in pondering over my new experiences and comparing them, very much to my own amusement, with my expectations, until I wander out again. The Villa Bagnarello, or the Pink Jail, a far more expressive name for the mansion, is in one of the most splendid situations imaginable. The noble bay of Genoa, with the deep blue Mediterranean, lies stretched out near at hand. Monstrous old desolate houses and palaces are dotted all about. Lofty hills, with their tops often hidden in the clouds, and with strong forts perched high up on their craggy sides, are close upon the left. And in front, stretching from the walls of the house, down to a ruined chapel which stands upon the bold and picturesque rocks on the seashore, are green vineyards, where you may wander all day long in partial shade, through interminable vistas of grapes, trained on a rough trellis-work across the narrow paths. This sequestered spot is approached by lanes so very narrow that when we arrived at the custom house, we found the people here had taken the measure of the narrowest among them, and were waiting to apply it to the carriage, which ceremony was gravely performed in the street, while we all stood by in breathless suspense. It was found to be a very tight fit, but just a possibility, and no more, as I am reminded every day by the sight of various large holes which it punched in the walls on either side as it came along. We are more fortunate, I am told, than an old lady, who took a house in these parts not long ago, and who stuck fast in her carriage in a lane, and as it was impossible to open one of the doors, she was obliged to submit to the indignity of being hauled through one of the little front windows, like a harlequin. When you have got through these narrow lanes, you come to an archway, imperfectly stopped up by a rusty old gate, my gate. The rusty old gate has a bell to correspond, which you ring as long as you like, and which nobody answers, as it has no connection whatever with the house. But there is a rusty old knocker, too very loose so that it slides round when you touch it, and if you learn the trick of it and knock long enough, somebody comes. The brave courier comes and gives you admittance. You walk into a seedy little garden, all wild and weedy, from which the vineyard opens, cross it, enter a square hall like a cellar, walk up a cracked marble staircase, and pass into a most enormous room with a vaulted roof and whitewashed walls, not unlike a great Methodist chapel. This is the sala. It has 5 windows and 5 doors, and is decorated with pictures which would gladden the heart of one of those picture cleaners in London who hang up, as a sign, a picture divided, like Death and the Lady, at the top of the old ballad, which always leaves you in a state of uncertainty whether the ingenious professor has cleaned one half or dirtied the other. The furniture of this sala is a sort of red brocade. All the chairs are immovable, and the sofa weighs several tons. On the same floor, and opening out of the same chamber, are dining room, drawing room, and divers bedrooms, each with a multiplicity of doors and windows. Upstairs are divers other gaunt chambers, and a kitchen, and downstairs is another kitchen, which, with all sorts of strange contrivances for burning charcoal, looks like an alchemical laboratory. There are also some half-dozen small sitting rooms, where the servants in this hot July may escape from the heat of the fire, and where the brave courier plays all sorts of musical instruments of his own manufacture, all the evening long. A mighty old, wandering, ghostly, echoing, grim, bare house it is, as ever I beheld or thought of. There is a little vine-covered terrace, opening from the drawing-room, and under this terrace and forming one side of the little garden is what used to be the stable. It is now a cow-house and has 3 cows in it, so that we get new milk by the bucketful. There is no pasturage near, and they never go out, but are constantly lying down and surfeiting themselves with vine leaves. Perfect Italian cows enjoying the dolce far niente all day long. They are presided over and slept with by an old man named Antonio and his son, 2 burnt sienna natives with naked legs and feet, who wear, each, a shirt, a pair of trousers, and a red sash, with a relic, or some sacred charm like the bonbon off a 12th cake, hanging round the neck. The old man is very anxious to convert me to the Catholic faith, and exhorts me frequently. We sit upon a stone by the door, sometimes in the evening, like Robinson Crusoe and Friday reversed, and he generally relates, towards my conversion, an abridgment of the history of St. Peter, chiefly, I believe, from the unspeakable delight he has in his imitation of the cock. The view, as I have said, is charming, but in the day you must keep the lattice blinds close shut, or the sun would drive you mad, and when the sun goes down, you must shut up all the windows, or the mosquitoes would tempt you to commit suicide. So at this time of the year, you don't see much of the prospect within doors. As for the flies, you don't mind them, nor the fleas, whose size is prodigious, and whose name is Legion, and who populate the coach-house to that extent that I daily expect to see the carriage going off bodily, drawn by myriads of industrious fleas in harness. The rats are kept away, quite comfortably, by scores of lean cats, who roam about the garden for that purpose. The lizards, of course, nobody cares for, they play in the sun and don't bite. The little scorpions are merely curious. The beetles are rather late and have not appeared yet. The frogs are company. There is a preserve of them in the grounds of the next villa, and after nightfall, one would think that scores upon scores of women in pattens were going up and down a wet stone pavement without a moment's cessation. That is exactly the noise they make. The ruined chapel, on the picturesque and beautiful seashore, was dedicated, once upon a time, to St. John the Baptist. I believe there is a legend that St. John's bones were received there, with various solemnities, when they were first brought to Genoa, for Genoa possesses them to this day. When there is any uncommon tempest at sea, they are brought out and exhibited to the raging weather, which they never fail to calm. In consequence of this connection of St. John with the city, great numbers of the common people are christened Giovanni Baptista, which latter name is pronounced in the Genoese patois Baciccia, like a sneeze. To hear everybody calling everybody else Baciccia, on a Sunday or festa day, when there are crowds in the streets, is not a little singular and amusing to a stranger. The narrow lanes have great villas opening into them, whose walls, outside walls, I mean, are profusely painted with all sorts of subjects, grim and holy. But time and the sea air have nearly obliterated them, and they look like the entrance to Vauxhall Gardens on a sunny day. The courtyards of these houses are overgrown with grass and weeds. All sorts of hideous patches cover the bases of the statues, as if they were afflicted with a cutaneous disorder. The outer gates are rusty, and the iron bars outside the lower windows are all tumbling down. Firewood is kept in halls where costly treasures might be heaped up, mountains high. Waterfalls are dry and choked. Fountains, too dull to play and too lazy to work, have just enough recollection of their identity in their sleep to make the neighborhood damp. And the sirocco wind is often blowing over all these things for days together, like a gigantic oven out for a holiday. Not long ago, there was a festa day in honor of the Virgin's mother, when the young men of the neighborhood, having worn green wreaths of the vine in some procession or other, bathed in them by scores. It looked very odd and pretty, though I am bound to confess, not knowing of the festa at that time, that I thought, and was quite satisfied, they wore them as horses do to keep the flies off. Soon afterwards, there was another festa day in honor of St. Nazaro. One of the Albero young men brought 2 large bouquets soon after breakfast, and coming upstairs into the great sala, presented them himself. This was a polite way of begging for a contribution towards the expenses of some music in the saint's honor, so we gave him whatever it may have been, and his messenger departed, well satisfied. At 6 o'clock in the evening we went to the church, close at hand, a very gaudy place, hung all over with festoons and bright draperies, and filled from the altar to the main door with women all seated. They wear no bonnets here, simply a long white veil, the mazzero, and it was the most gauzy, ethereal-looking audience I ever saw. The young women are not generally pretty, but they walk remarkably well, and in their personal carriage and the management of their veils, display much innate grace and elegance. There were some men present, not very many, and a few of these were kneeling about the aisles, while everybody else tumbled over them. Innumerable tapers were burning in the church. The bits of silver and tin about the saints, especially in the Virgin's necklace, sparkled brilliantly. The priests were seated about the chief altar, the organ played away lustily, and a full band did the like, while a conductor, in a little gallery opposite to the band, hammered away on the desk before him with a scroll, and a tenor without any voice sang. The band played one way, the organ played another, the singer went a third, and the unfortunate conductor banged and flourished his scroll on some principle of his own, apparently well satisfied with the whole performance. I never did hear such a discordant din. The heat was intense all the time. The men, in red caps and with loose coats hanging on their shoulders, they never put them on, were playing bowls and buying sweetmeats immediately outside the church. When half a dozen of them finished a game, they came into the aisle, crossed themselves with the holy water, knelt on one knee for an instant, and walked off again to play another game at bowls. They are remarkably expert at this diversion, and will play in the stony lanes and streets, and on the most uneven and disastrous ground for such a purpose, with as much nicety as on a billiard table. But the most favorite game is the national one of Mora, which they pursue with surprising ardor, and at which they will stake everything they possess. It is a destructive kind of gambling, requiring no accessories but the 10 fingers, which are always, I intend no pun, at hand. 2 men play together. One calls a number, say the extreme one 10. He marks what portion of it he pleases by throwing out 3 or 4 or 5 fingers, and his adversary has, in the same instant, at hazard, and without seeing his hand, to throw out as many fingers as will make the exact balance. Their eyes and hands become so used to this, and act with such astonishing rapidity, that an uninitiated bystander would find it very difficult, if not impossible, to follow the progress of the game. The initiated, however, of whom there is always an eager group looking on, devour it with the most intense avidity, and as they are always ready to champion one side or the other in case of a dispute, and are frequently divided in their partisanship, it is often a very noisy proceeding. It is never the quietest game in the world, for the numbers are always called in a loud, sharp voice, and follow as close upon each other as they can be counted. On a holiday evening, standing at a window, or walking in a garden, or passing through the streets, or sauntering in any quiet place about the town, you will hear this game in progress in a score of wineshops at once, and looking over any vineyard walk, or turning almost any corner, will come upon a knot of players in full cry. It is observable that most men have a propensity to throw out some particular number oftener than another, and the vigilance with which 2 sharp-eyed players will mutually endeavor to detect this weakness, and adapt their game to it, is very curious and entertaining. The effect is greatly heightened by the universal suddenness and vehemence of gesture, 2 men playing for half a farthing with an intensity as all-absorbing as if the stake were life. Hard by here is a large palazzo, formerly belonging to some member of the Brignole family, but just now hired by a school of Jesuits for their summer quarters. I walked into its dismantled precincts the other evening about sunset, and couldn't help pacing up and down for a little time, drowsily taking in the aspect of the place, which is repeated hereabouts in all directions. I loitered to and fro under a colonnade, forming 2 sides of a weedy, grass-grown courtyard, whereof the house formed a 3rd side, and a low terrace walk, overlooking the garden and the neighboring hills, the 4th. I don't believe there was an uncracked stone in the whole pavement. In the center was a melancholy statue, so piebald in its decay that it looked exactly as if it had been covered with sticking plaster and afterwards powdered. The stables, coach-houses, offices were all empty, all ruinous, all utterly deserted. Doors had lost their hinges and were holding on by their latches. Windows were broken, painted plaster had peeled off and was lying about in clods. Fowls and cats had so taken possession of the outbuildings that I couldn't help thinking of the fairy tales and eyeing them with suspicion as transformed retainers, waiting to be changed back again. One old Tom in particular, a scraggy brute with a hungry green eye, a poor relation in reality I am inclined to think, came prowling round and round me, as if he half believed for the moment that I might be the hero come to marry the lady, and set all to rights, but discovering his mistake, he suddenly gave a grim snarl, and walked away with such a tremendous tail, that he couldn't get into the little hole where he lived, but was obliged to wait outside, until his indignation and his tail had gone down together. In a sort of summer house, or whatever it may be, in this colonnade, some Englishmen had been living like grubs in a nut, but the Jesuits had given them notice to go, and they had gone, and that was shut up too. The house, a wandering, echoing, thundering barrack of a place, with the lower windows barred up as usual, was wide open at the door, and I have no doubt I might have gone in and gone to bed and gone dead, and nobody a bit the wiser. Only one suite of rooms on an upper floor was tenanted, and from one of these the voice of a young lady vocalist, practicing bravura lustily, came flaunting out upon the silent evening. I went down into the garden, intended to be prim and quaint, with avenues and terraces and orange trees and statues and water in stone basins. And everything was green, gaunt, weedy, straggling, undergrown or overgrown, mildewy, damp, redolent of all sorts of slabby, clammy, creeping, and uncomfortable life. There was nothing bright in the whole scene but a firefly, one solitary firefly, showing against the dark bushes like the last little speck of the departed glory of the house. And even it went flitting up and down at sudden angles, and leaving a place with a jerk, and describing an irregular circle, and returning to the same place with a twitch that startled one, as if it were looking for the rest of the glory and wondering, heaven knows it might, what had become of it. In the course of 2 months, the flitting shapes and shadows of my dismal entering reverie gradually resolved themselves into familiar forms and substances, and I already began to think that when the time should come, a year hence, for closing the long holiday and turning back to England, I might part from Genoa with anything but a glad heart. It is a place that grows upon you every day. There seems to be always something to find out in it. There are the most extraordinary alleys and byways to walk about in. You can lose your way, what a comfort that is when you are idle, 20 times a day if you like, and turn up again under the most unexpected and surprising difficulties. It abounds in the strangest contrasts. Things that are picturesque, ugly, mean, magnificent, delightful, and offensive break upon the view at every turn. They who would know how beautiful the country immediately surrounding Genoa is, should climb in clear weather to the top of Monte Faccio, or at least ride round the city walls. A feat more easily performed. No prospect can be more diversified and lovely than the changing views of the harbor, and the valleys of the 2 rivers, the Polsevera and the Bisagno, from the heights along which the strongly fortified walls are carried, like the Great Wall of China in little. In not the least picturesque part of this ride, there is a fair specimen of a real Genoese tavern, where the visitor may derive good entertainment from real Genoese dishes, such as tagliarini, ravioli, German sausages, strong of garlic, sliced and eaten, with fresh green figs, cocks' combs and sheep kidneys, chopped up with mutton chops and liver, small pieces of some unknown part of a calf, twisted into small shreds, fried, and served up in a great dish like white bait, and other curiosities of that kind. They often get wine at these suburban trattorie, from France and Spain and Portugal, which is brought over by small captains in little trading vessels. They buy it at so much a bottle, without asking what it is, or caring to remember if anybody tells them, and usually divide it into 2 heaps, of which they label one champagne and the other Madeira. The various opposite flavors, qualities, countries, ages, and vintages that are comprised under these 2 general heads is quite extraordinary. The most limited range is probably from cool gruel up to old Marsala, and down again to apple tea. The great majority of the streets are as narrow as any thoroughfare can well be, where people, even Italian people, are supposed to live and walk about, being mere lanes, with here and there a kind of well or breathing place. The houses are immensely high, painted in all sorts of colors, and are in every stage and state of damage, dirt, and lack of repair. They are commonly let off in floors or flats, like the houses in the old town of Edinburgh, or many houses in Paris. There are few street doors. The entrance halls are, for the most part, looked upon as public property, and any moderately enterprising scavenger might make a fine fortune by now and then clearing them out. As it is impossible for coaches to penetrate into these streets, there are sedan chairs, gilded and otherwise, for hire in divers places. A great many private chairs are also kept among the nobility and gentry, and at night these are trotted to and fro in all directions, preceded by bearers of great lanthorns, made of linen stretched upon a frame. The sedans and lanthorns are the legitimate successors of the long strings of patient and much-abused mules that go jingling their little bells through these confined streets all day long. They follow them, as regularly as the stars the sun. When shall I forget the streets of palaces, the Strada Nuova and the Strada Balbi, or how the former looked one summer day, when I first saw it underneath the brightest and most intensely blue of summer skies, which its narrow perspective of immense mansions, reduced to a tapering and most precious strip of brightness, looking down upon the heavy shade below. A brightness not too common, even in July and August, to be well esteemed, for if the truth must out, there were not 8 blue skies in as many midsummer weeks, saving, sometimes, early in the morning, when looking out to sea, the water and the firmament were one world of deep and brilliant blue. At other times, there were clouds and haze enough to make an Englishman grumble in his own climate. The endless details of these rich palaces, the walls of some of them, within, alive with masterpieces by Van Dyck. The great, heavy stone balconies, one above another and tier over tier, with here and there one larger than the rest, towering high up, a huge marble platform, the doorless vestibules, massively barred lower windows, immense public staircases, thick marble pillars, strong dungeon-like arches, and dreary, dreaming, echoing vaulted chambers, among which the eye wanders again, and again, and again, as every palace is succeeded by another. The terrace gardens between house and house, with green arches of the vine, and groves of orange trees and blushing oleander in full bloom, 20, 30, 40 feet above the street. The painted halls, moldering and blotting and rotting in the damp corners, and still shining out in beautiful colors and voluptuous designs where the walls are dry. The faded figures on the outsides of the houses, holding wreaths and crowns and flying upward and downward and standing in niches, and here and there looking fainter and more feeble than elsewhere by contrast with some fresh little cupids, who on a more recently decorated portion of the front are stretching out what seems to be the semblance of a blanket, but is indeed a sundial, the steep, steep uphill streets of small palaces, but very large palaces for all that, with marble terraces looking down into close-by ways, the magnificent and innumerable churches, and the rapid passage from a street of stately edifices into a maze of the vilest squalor, steaming with unwholesome stenches and swarming with half-naked children and whole worlds of dirty people, make up altogether such a scene of wonder, so lively and yet so dead, so noisy and yet so quiet, so obtrusive and yet so shy and lowering, so wide awake and yet so fast asleep, that it is a sort of intoxication to a stranger to walk on, and on, and on, and look about him. A bewildering phantasmagoria, with all the inconsistency of a dream, and all the pain and all the pleasure of an extravagant reality. The different uses to which some of these palaces are applied, all at once, is characteristic. For instance, the English banker, my excellent and hospitable friend, has his office in a good-sized palazzo in the Strada Nuova, in the hall every inch of which is elaborately painted, but which is as dirty as a police station in London. A hook-nosed Saracen's head with an immense quantity of black hair, there is a man attached to it, sells walking sticks. On the other side of the doorway, a lady with a showy handkerchief for head dress, wife to the Saracen's head, I believe, sells articles of her own knitting, and sometimes flowers. A little further in, 2 or 3 blind men occasionally beg. Sometimes they are visited by a man without legs, on a little go-kart, but who has such a fresh-colored, lively face, and such a respectable, well-conditioned body, that he looks as if he had sunk into the ground up to his middle, or had come, but partially, up a flight of cellar steps to speak to somebody. A little further in, a few men perhaps lie asleep in the middle of the day, or they may be chairmen waiting for their absent freight. If so, they have brought their chairs in with them, and there they stand also. On the left of the hall is a little room, a hatter's shop. On the first floor is the English bank. On the first floor also is a whole house, and a good large residence too. Heaven knows what there may be above that, but when you are there, you have only just begun to go upstairs. And yet, coming downstairs again, thinking of this, and passing out at a great crazy door in the back of the hall, instead of turning the other way to get into the street again, it bangs behind you, making the smallest and most lonesome echoes, and you stand in a yard, the yard of the same house, which seems to have been unvisited by human foot for 100 years. Not a sound disturbs its repose, not a head, thrust out of any of the grim, dark, jealous windows, within sight, makes the weeds in the cracked pavement faint of heart, by suggesting the possibility of there being hands to grub them up. Opposite to you is a giant figure carved in stone, reclining with an urn upon a lofty piece of artificial rockwork, and out of the urn dangles the fag end of a leaden pipe, which once upon a time poured a small torrent down the rocks. But the eye sockets of the giant are not drier than this channel is now. He seems to have given his urn, which is nearly upside down, a final tilt, and after crying like a sepulchral child, all gone, to have lapsed into a stony silence. The streets of shops, the houses are much smaller, but of great size notwithstanding, and extremely high. They are very dirty, quite undrained if my nose be at all reliable, and emit a peculiar fragrance like the smell of very bad cheese kept in very hot blankets. Notwithstanding the height of the houses, there would seem to have been a lack of room in the city, for new houses are thrust in everywhere. Wherever it has been possible to cram a tumble-down tenement into a crack or corner, in it has gone. If there be a nook or angle in the wall of a church, or a crevice in any other dead wall, of any sort, there you are sure to find some kind of habitation, looking as if it had grown there, like a fungus. Against the government house, against the old Senate house, round about any large building, little shops stick so close, like parasite vermin to the great carcase. And for all this, look where you may. Up steps, down steps, anywhere, everywhere. There are irregular houses, receding, starting forward, tumbling down, leaning against their neighbors, crippling themselves or their friends by some means or other, until one, more irregular than the rest, chokes up the way, and you can't see any further. One of the rottingest-looking parts of the town, I think, is down by the landing wharf, though it may be that its being associated with a great deal of rottenness on the evening of our arrival has stamped it deeper in my mind. Here again, the houses are very high, and are of an infinite variety of deformed shapes, and have, as most of the houses have, something hanging out of a great many windows, and wafting its frowsy fragrance on the breeze. Sometimes it is a curtain, sometimes it is a carpet, sometimes it is a bed, sometimes a whole lineful of clothes, but there is almost always something. Before the basement of these houses is an arcade over the pavement, very massive, dark, and low, like an old crypt. The stone or plaster of which it is made has turned quite black, and against every one of these black piles, all sorts of filth and garbage seem to accumulate spontaneously. Beneath some of the arches, the sellers of macaroni and polenta establish their stalls, which are by no means inviting. The offal of a fish market near at hand, that is to say, of a back lane, where people sit upon the ground and on various old bulkheads and sheds, and sell fish when they have any to dispose of, and of a vegetable market, constructed on the same principle, are contributed to the decoration of this quarter. And as all the mercantile business is transacted here, and it is crowded all day, it has a very decided flavor about it. The Porto Franco, or free port, where goods brought in from foreign countries pay no duty until they are sold and taken out, as in a bonded warehouse in England, is down here also, and two portentous officials in cocked hats stand at the gate to search you if they choose, and to keep out monks and ladies. For sanctity as well as beauty has been known to yield to the temptation of smuggling, and in the same way, that is to say, by concealing the smuggled property beneath the loose folds of its dress. So sanctity and beauty may by no means enter. The streets of Genoa would be all the better for the importation of a few priests of prepossessing appearance. Every fourth or fifth man in the streets is a priest or a monk, and there is pretty sure to be at least one itinerant ecclesiastic inside or outside every hackney carriage on the neighboring roads. I have no knowledge elsewhere of more repulsive countenances than are to be found among these gentry. If nature's handwriting be at all legible, greater varieties of sloth, deceit, and intellectual torpor could hardly be observed among any class of men in the world. Mr. Pepys once heard a clergyman assert in his sermon, in illustration of his respect for the priestly office, that if he could meet a priest and angel together, he would salute the priest first. I am rather of the opinion of Petrarch, who, when his pupil Boccaccio wrote to him in great tribulation, that he had been visited and admonished for his writings by a Carthusian friar who claimed to be a messenger immediately commissioned by heaven for that purpose, replied that for his own part, he would take the liberty of testing the reality of the commission by personal observation of the messenger's face, eyes, forehead, behavior, and discourse. I cannot but believe myself, from similar observation, that many unaccredited celestial messengers may be seen skulking through the streets of Genoa, or droning away their lives in other Italian towns. Perhaps the Cappuccini, though not a learned body, are, as an order, the best friends of the people. They seem to mingle with them more immediately, as their counselors and comforters, and to go among them more when they are sick, and to pry less than some other orders into the secrets of families, for the purpose of establishing a baleful ascendancy over their weaker members, and to be influenced by a less fierce desire to make converts, and once made to let them go to ruin, soul and body. They may be seen in their coarse dress in all parts of the town at all times, and begging in the markets early in the morning. The Jesuits, too, muster strong in the streets, and go slinking noiselessly about, in pairs like black cats. In some of the narrow passages, distinct trades congregate. There is a street of jewelers, and there is a row of booksellers, but even down in places where nobody ever can, or ever could, penetrate in a carriage, there are mighty old palaces shut in among the gloomiest and closest walls, and almost shut out from the sun. Very few of the tradesmen have any idea of setting forth their goods, or disposing them for show. If you, a stranger, want to buy anything, you usually look round the shop till you see it, then clutch it if it be within reach and inquire how much. Everything is sold at the most unlikely place. If you want coffee, you go to a sweetmeat shop, and if you want meat, you will probably find it behind an old checked curtain, down half a dozen steps, in some sequestered nook as hard to find as if the commodity were poison, and Genoa's law were death to any that uttered it. Most of the apothecaries' shops are great lounging places. Here, grave men with sticks sit down in the shade for hours together, passing a meager Genoa paper from hand to hand, and talking drowsily and sparingly about the news. 2 or 3 of these are poor physicians, ready to proclaim themselves on an emergency, and tear off with any messenger who may arrive. You may know them by the way in which they stretch their necks to listen when you enter, and by the sigh with which they fall back again into their dull corners, on finding that you only want medicine. Few people lounge in the barbers' shops, though they are very numerous, as hardly any man shaves himself. But the apothecaries has its group of loungers, who sit back among the bottles, with their hands folded over the tops of their sticks. So still and quiet, that either you don't see them in the darkened shop or mistake them, as I did one ghostly man in bottle green, one day with a hat like a stopper for horse medicine. On a summer evening, the Genoese are as fond of putting themselves, as their ancestors were of putting houses, in every available inch of space in and about the town. In all the lanes and alleys, and up every little ascent, and on every dwarf wall, and on every flight of steps, they cluster like bees. Meanwhile, and especially on festidays, the bells of the churches ring incessantly, not in peals or any known form of sound, but in a horrible, irregular, jerking dingle, 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 with a sudden stop at every 15th dingle or so, which is maddening. This performance is usually achieved by a boy up in the steeple, who takes hold of the clapper, or a little rope attached to it, and tries to dingle louder than every other boy similarly employed. The noise is supposed to be particularly obnoxious to evil spirits, but looking up into the steeples, and seeing, and hearing, these young Christians thus engaged, one might very naturally mistake them for the enemy. Festidays early in the autumn are very numerous. All the shops were shut up twice within a week for these holidays, and one night all the houses in the neighborhood of a particular church were illuminated, while the church itself was lighted, outside p. 250 with torches, and a grove of blazing links was erected, in an open space outside one of the city gates. This part of the ceremony is prettier and more singular a little way in the country, where you can trace the illuminated cottages all the way up a steep hillside, and where you pass festoons of tapers, wasting away in the starlight night, before some lonely little house upon the road. On these days, they always dress the church of the saint in whose honor the festa is holden, very gaily. Gold-embroidered festoons of different colors hang from the arches, the altar furniture is set forth, and sometimes even the lofty pillars are swathed from top to bottom in tight-fitting draperies. The cathedral is dedicated to St. Lorenzo. On St. Lorenzo's day, we went into it, just as the sun was setting. Although these decorations are usually in very indifferent taste, the effect, just then, was very superb indeed, for the whole building was dressed in red, and the sinking sun, streaming in through a great red curtain in the chief doorway, made all the gorgeousness its own. When the sun went down, and it gradually grew quite dark inside, except for a few twinkling tapers on the principal altar, and some small dangling silver lamps, it was very mysterious and effective. But sitting in any of the churches towards evening is like a mild dose of opium. With the money collected at a festa, they usually pay for the dressing of the church, and for the hiring of the band, and for the tapers. If there be any left, which seldom happens, I believe, the souls in purgatory get the benefit of it. They are also supposed to have the benefit of the exertions of certain small boys, who shake money boxes before some mysterious little buildings like rural turnpikes, which usually shut up close, fly open on red-letter days, and disclose an image and some flowers inside. Just without the city gate, on the Albarra road, is a small house, with an altar in it and a stationary money box, also for the benefit of the souls in purgatory. Still further to stimulate the charitable, there is a monstrous painting on the plaster on either side of the grated door, representing a select party of souls frying. One of them has a gray mustache and an elaborate head of gray hair, as if he had been taken out of a hairdresser's window and cast into the furnace. There he is, a most grotesque and hideously comic old soul, forever blistering in the real sun, and melting in the mimic fire for the gratification and improvement and the contributions of the poor Genoese. They are not a very joyous people, and are seldom seen to dance on their holidays, the staple places of entertainment among the women being the churches and the public walks. They are very good-tempered, obliging, and industrious. Industry has not made them clean, for their habitations are extremely filthy, and their usual occupation on a fine Sunday morning is to sit at their doors, hunting in each other's heads. But their dwellings are so close and confined that if those parts of the city had been beaten down by Messina in the time of the terrible blockade, it would have at least occasioned one public benefit among many misfortunes. The peasant women, with naked feet and legs, are so constantly washing clothes in the public tanks and in every stream and ditch that one cannot help wondering, in the midst of all this dirt, who wears them when they are clean. The custom is to lay the wet linen which is being operated upon on a smooth stone and hammer away at it with a flat wooden mallet. This they do, as furiously as if they were revenging themselves on dress in general for being connected with the fall of mankind. It is not unusual to see, lying on the edge of the tank at these times, or on another flat stone, an unfortunate baby, tightly swathed up, arms and legs and all in an enormous quantity of wrapper, so that it is unable to move a toe or finger. This custom, which we often see represented in old pictures, is universal among the common people. A child is left anywhere without the possibility of crawling away, or is accidentally knocked off a shelf, or tumbled out of bed, or is hung up to a hook now and then, and left dangling like a doll at an English rag shop, without the least inconvenience to anybody. I was sitting, one Sunday, soon after my arrival, in the little country church of San Martino, a couple of miles from the city, while a baptism took place. I saw the priest and an attendant with a large taper, and a man and a woman and some others. But I had no more idea, until the ceremony was all over, that it was a baptism, or that the curious little stiff instrument, that was passed from one to another in the course of the ceremony by the handle, like short poker, was a child, than I had that it was my own christening. I borrowed the child afterwards. For a minute or two it was lying across the font then, and found it very red in the face but perfectly quiet, and not to be bent on any terms. The number of cripples in the streets soon ceased to surprise me. There are plenty of saints and virgins' shrines, of course, generally at the corners of streets. The favorite memento to the faithful about Genoa is a painting, representing a peasant on his knees, with a spade and some other agricultural implements beside him, and the Madonna, with the infant Savior in her arms, appearing to him in a cloud. This is the legend of the Madonna della Guardia, a chapel on a mountain within a few miles, which is in high repute. It seems that this peasant lived all alone by himself, tilling some land atop of the mountain, where, being a devout man, he daily said his prayers to the Virgin in the open air, for his hut was a very poor one. Upon a certain day, the Virgin appeared to him, as in the picture, and said, "Why do you pray in the open air and without a priest?" The peasant explained because there was neither priest nor church at hand, a very uncommon complaint indeed in Italy. "I should wish then," said the celestial visitor, "to have a chapel built here in which the prayers of the faithful may be offered up." "But, Santissima Madonna," said the peasant, "I am a poor man, and chapels cannot be built without money. They must be supported too, Santissima, for to have a chapel and not support it liberally is a wickedness, a deadly sin." This sentiment gave great satisfaction to the visitor. "Go," said she. "There is such a village in the valley on the left, and such another village in the valley on the right, and such another village elsewhere, that will gladly contribute to the building of a chapel. Go to them, relate what you have seen, and do not doubt that sufficient money will be forthcoming to erect my chapel, or that it will, afterwards, be handsomely maintained." All of which, miraculously, turned out to be quite true, and in proof of this prediction and revelation, there is the chapel of the Madonna della Guardia, rich and flourishing at this day. The splendor and variety of the Genoese churches can hardly be exaggerated. The Church of the Annunziata especially, built, like many of the others, at the cost of one noble family, and now in slow progress of repair, from the outer door to the utmost height of the high cupola, is so elaborately painted and set in gold that it looks, as Simon describes it in his charming book on Italy, like a great enameled snuff-box. Most of the richer churches contain some beautiful pictures or other embellishments of great price, almost universally set, side by side, with sprawling effigies of maudlin monks and the various trash and tinsel ever seen. It may be a consequence of the frequent direction of the popular mind and pocket to the souls in purgatory, but there is very little tenderness for the bodies of the dead here. For the very poor there are, immediately outside one angle of the walls, and behind a jutting point of the fortification, near the sea, certain common pits, one for every day in the year, which all remain closed up, until the turn of each comes for its daily reception of dead bodies. Among the troops in the town, there are usually some Swiss, more or less. When any of these die, they are buried out of a fund maintained by such of their countrymen as are resident in Genoa. Their providing coffins for these men is matter of great astonishment to the authorities. Certainly, the effect of this promiscuous and indecent splashing down of dead people in so many wells is bad. It surrounds death with revolting associations that insensibly become connected with those whom death is approaching. Indifference and avoidance are the natural result, and all the softening influences of the great sorrow are harshly disturbed. There is a ceremony when an old cavaliere or the like expires of erecting a pile of benches in the cathedral to represent his bier, covering them over with a pall of black velvet, putting his hat and sword on the top, making a little square of seats about the whole, and sending out formal invitations to his friends and acquaintances to come and sit there and hear Mass, which is performed at the principal altar, decorated with an infinity of candles for that purpose. When the better kind of people die, or are at the point of death, their nearest relations generally walk off, retiring into the country for a little change, and leaving the body to be disposed of, without any superintendence from them. The procession is usually formed, and the coffin borne and the funeral conducted by a body of persons called a confragianita, who, as a kind of voluntary penance, undertake to perform these offices in regular rotation for the dead, but who, mingling something of pride with their humility, are dressed in a loose garment covering their whole person, and wear a hood concealing the face with breathing holes and apertures for the eyes. The effect of this costume is very ghastly, especially in the case of a certain blue confragianita belonging to Genoa, who, to say the least of them, are very ugly customers, and who look, suddenly encountered in their pious ministration in the streets, as if they were ghouls or demons, bearing off the body for themselves. Although such a custom may be liable to the abuse attendant on many Italian customs, of being recognized as a means of establishing a current account with heaven, on which to draw too easily for future bad actions, or as an expiation for past misdeeds, it must be admitted to be a good one, and a practical one, and one involving unquestionably good works. A voluntary service like this is surely better than the imposed penance, not at all an infrequent one, of giving so many licks to such and such a stone in the pavement of the cathedral, or than a vow to the Madonna to wear nothing but blue for a year or two. This is supposed to give great delight above, blue being, as is well known, the Madonna's favorite color. Women who have devoted themselves to this act of faith are very commonly seen walking in the streets. There are 3 theaters in the city, besides an old one now rarely opened. The most important, the Carlo Fellis, the Opera House of Genoa, is a very splendid, commodious, and beautiful theater. A company of comedians were acting there when we arrived, and soon after their departure, a second-rate opera company came. The great season is not until the carnival time in the spring. Nothing impressed me so much in my visits here, which were pretty numerous, as the uncommonly hard and cruel character of the audience, who resent the slightest defect, take nothing good-humoredly, seem to be always lying in wait for an opportunity to hiss, and spare the actresses as little as the actors. But as there is nothing else of a public nature at which they are allowed to express the least disapprobation, perhaps they are resolved to make the most of this opportunity. There are a great number of Piedmontese officers, too, who are allowed the privilege of kicking their heels in the pit, for next to nothing, gratuitous or cheap accommodation for these gentlemen being insisted on by the governor in all public or semi-public entertainments. They are lofty critics in consequence, and infinitely more exacting than if they made the unhappy manager's fortune. The Teatro Diurno or day theater is a covered stage in the open air, where the performances take place by daylight in the cool of the afternoon, commencing at 4 or 5 o'clock and lasting some 3 hours. It is curious, sitting among the audience, to have a fine view of the neighboring hills and houses, and to see the neighbors at their windows looking on, and to hear the bells of the churches and convents ringing at most complete cross-purposes with the scene. Beyond this, and the novelty of seeing a play in the fresh pleasant air, with the darkening evening closing in, there is nothing very exciting or characteristic in the performances. The actors are indifferent, and though they sometimes represent one of Goldoni's comedies, the staple of the drama is French. Anything like nationality is dangerous to despotic governments and Jesuit-beleaguered kings. The Theatre of Puppets, or Marionette, a famous company from Milan, is without any exception the drollest exhibition I ever beheld in my life. I never saw anything so exquisitely ridiculous. They look between 4 and 5 feet high, but are really much smaller. For when a musician in the orchestra happens to put his hat on the stage, it becomes alarmingly gigantic and almost blots out an actor. They usually play a comedy and a ballet. The comic man in the comedy I saw one summer night is a waiter in an hotel. There never was such a locomotive actor since the world began. Great pains are taken with him. He has extra joints in his legs, and a practical eye with which he winks at the pit in a manner that is absolutely insupportable to a stranger, but which the initiated audience, mainly composed of the common people, receive, so they do everything else quite as a matter of course, and as if he were a man. His spirits are prodigious. He continually shakes his legs and winks his eye. And there is a heavy father with gray hair, who sits down on the regular conventional stage bank and blesses his daughter in the regular conventional way, who is tremendous. No one would suppose it possible that anything short of a real man could be so tedious. It is the triumph of art. In the ballet, an enchanter runs away with the bride. In the very hour of her nuptials, he brings her to his cave and tries to soothe her. They sit down on a sofa, the regular sofa. In the regular place, OP second entrance, and a procession of musicians enters, one creature playing a drum and knocking himself off his legs at every blow. These failing to delight her, dancers appear. 4 first, then 2, the flesh-colored 2. The way in which they dance, the height to which they spring, the impossible and inhuman extent to which they pirouette, the revelation of their preposterous legs, the coming down with a pause on the very tips of their toes when the music requires it, the gentleman's retiring up when it is the lady's turn, and the lady's retiring up when it is the gentleman's turn, the final passion of a pas de deux, and the going off with a bound. I shall never see a real ballet with a composed countenance again. I went, another night, to see these puppets act a play called St. Helena, or the Death of Napoleon. It began by the disclosure of Napoleon, with an immense head, seated on a sofa in his chamber at St. Helena, to whom his valet entered with this obscure announcement. Sir, you ud see on low, the ow as in cow. Sir Hudson, that you could have seen his regimentals, was a perfect mammoth of a man to Napoleon, hideously ugly, with a monstrously disproportionate face, and a great clump for the lower jaw, to express his tyrannical and obdurate nature. He began his system of persecution by calling his prisoner General Buonaparte, to which the latter replied, with the deepest tragedy, Sir, you ud see on low, call me not thus. Repeat that phrase and leave me. I am Napoleon, Emperor of France. Sir, you ud see on, nothing daunted, proceeded to entertain him with an ordinance of the British government, regulating the state he should preserve and the furniture of his rooms, and limiting his attendance to 4 or 5 persons. 4 or 5 for me, said Napoleon. Me, 100,000 men were lately at my sole command, and this English officer talks of 4 or 5 for me. Throughout the piece, Napoleon, who talked very like the real Napoleon, and was, forever, having small soliloquies by himself, was very bitter on these English officers, and these English soldiers, to the great satisfaction of the audience, who were perfectly delighted to have Low bullied, and who, whenever Low said General Buonaparte, which he always did, always receiving the same correction, quite execrated him. It would be hard to say why, for Italians have little cause to sympathize with Napoleon, heaven knows. There was no plot at all, except that a French officer, disguised as an Englishman, came to propound a plan of escape, and being discovered, but not before Napoleon had magnanimously refused to steal his freedom, was immediately ordered off by Low to be hanged. In 2 very long speeches, which Low made memorable by winding up with Yas, to show that he was English, which brought down thunders of applause. Napoleon was so affected by this catastrophe that he fainted away on the spot and was carried out by 2 other puppets. Judging from what followed, it would appear that he never recovered the shock, for the next act showed him, in a clean shirt, in his bed curtains crimson and white, where a lady, prematurely dressed in mourning, brought 2 little children, who kneeled down by the bedside, while he made a decent end, the last word on his lips being Vaterlo. It was unspeakably ludicrous. Buonaparte's boots were so wonderfully beyond control, and did such marvelous things of their own accord, doubling themselves up, and getting under tables, and dangling in the air, and sometimes skating away with him, out of all human knowledge, when he was in full speech, mischances which were not rendered the less absurd by a settled melancholy depicted in his face. To put an end to one conference with Lowe, he had to go to a table and read a book, when it was the finest spectacle I ever beheld, to see his body bending over the volume like a bootjack, and his sentimental eyes glaring obstinately into the pit. He was prodigiously good, in bed, with an immense collar to his shirt, and his little hands outside the coverlet. So was Dr. Antimarchy, represented by a puppet with long lank hair, like mawworms, who, in consequence of some derangement of his wires, hovered about the couch like a vulture, and gave medical opinions in the air. He was almost as good as Lowe, though the latter was great at all times, a decided brute and villain beyond all possibility of mistake. Lowe was especially fine at the last, when hearing the doctor and the valet say, "The emperor is dead." He pulled out his watch and wound up the piece, not the watch, by exclaiming with characteristic brutality, "Ha ha, 11 minutes to 6, the general dead, and the spy hanged." This brought the curtain down triumphantly. There is not in Italy, they say, and I believe them, a lovelier residence than the Palazzo Peschiere, or Palace of the Fishponds, whither we removed as soon as our 3 months' tenancy of the Pink Jail at Albaro had ceased and determined. It stands on a height within the walls of Genoa, but aloof from the town, surrounded by beautiful gardens of its own, adorned with statues, vases, fountains, marble basins, terraces, walks of orange trees and lemon trees, groves of roses and camellias. All its apartments are beautiful in their proportions and decorations. But the great hall, some 50 feet in height, with 3 large windows at the end, overlooking the whole town of Genoa, the harbor, and the neighboring sea, affords one of the most fascinating and delightful prospects in the world. Any house more cheerful and habitable than the great rooms are, within, it would be difficult to conceive, and certainly nothing more delicious than the scene without, in sunshine or in moonlight, could be imagined. It is more like an enchanted place in an Eastern story than a grave and sober lodging. How you may wander on, from room to room, and never tire of the wild fancies on the walls and ceilings, as bright in their fresh coloring as if they had been painted yesterday. Or how one floor, or even the great hall which opens on 8 other rooms, is a spacious promenade. Or how there are corridors and bedchambers above, which we never use and rarely visit, and scarcely know the way through, or how there is a view of a perfectly different character on each of the 4 sides of the building, matters little. But that prospect from the hall is like a vision to me. I go back to it, in fancy, as I have done in calm reality 100 times a day, and stand there, looking out, with the sweet scents from the garden rising up about me, in a perfect dream of happiness. There lies all Genoa, in beautiful confusion, with its many churches, monasteries, and convents, pointing up into the sunny sky. And down below me, just where the roofs begin, a solitary convent parapet, fashioned like a gallery, with an iron across at the end, where sometimes early in the morning, I have seen a little group of dark-veiled nuns gliding sorrowfully to and fro, and stopping now and then to peep down upon the waking world in which they have no part. Old Monte Faccio, brightest of hills in good weather but sulkiest when storms are coming on, is here upon the left. The fort within the walls, the good king built it to command the town and beat the houses of the Genoese about their ears, in case they should be discontented, commands that height upon the right. The broad sea lies beyond in front there, and that line of coast, beginning by the lighthouse and tapering away, a mere speck in the rosy distance, is the beautiful coast road that leads to Nice. The garden near at hand, among the roofs and houses, all red with roses and fresh with little fountains, is the Acquasola, a public promenade where the military band plays gaily and the white veils cluster thick, and the Genoese nobility ride round and round and round in state clothes and coaches at least, if not in absolute wisdom. Within a stone's throw, as it seems, the audience of the day theatre sit, their faces turned this way. But as the stage is hidden, it is very odd, without a knowledge of the cause, to see their faces changed so suddenly from earnestness to laughter, and odder still, to hear the rounds upon rounds of applause, rattling in the evening air to which the curtain falls. But being Sunday night, they act their best and most attractive play. And now, the sun is going down, in such magnificent array of red and green and golden light, as neither pen nor pencil could depict. And to the ringing of the vesper bells, darkness sets in at once, without a twilight. Then, lights begin to shine in Genoa, and on the country road, and the revolving lanthorn out at sea there, flashing, for an instant, on this palace front and portico, illuminates it as if there were a bright moon bursting from behind a cloud, then merges it in deep obscurity. And this, so far as I know, is the only reason why the Genoese avoid it after dark, and think it haunted. My memory will haunt it many nights in time to come, but nothing worse I will engage. The same ghost will occasionally sail away, as I did one pleasant autumn evening, into the bright prospect and sniff the morning air at Marseille. The corpulent hairdresser was still sitting in his slippers outside his shop door there, but the twirling ladies in the window, with the natural inconstancy of their sex, had ceased to twirl, and were languishing, stock still, with their beautiful faces addressed to blind corners of the establishment, where it was impossible for admirers to penetrate. The steamer had come from Genoa in a delicious run of 18 hours, and we were going to run back again by the Cornice road from Nice, not being satisfied to have seen only the outsides of the beautiful towns that rise in picturesque white clusters from among the olive woods, and rocks, and hills, upon the margin of the sea. The boat which started for Nice that night at 8 o'clock was very small, and so crowded with goods that there was scarcely room to move. Neither was there anything to cat on board except bread, nor to drink except coffee. But being due at Nice at about 8 or so in the morning, this was of no consequence. So when we began to wink at the bright stars, in involuntary acknowledgment of their winking at us, we turned into our berths in a crowded but cool little cabin, and slept soundly till morning. The boat, being as dull and dogged a little boat as ever was built, it was within an hour of noon when we turned into Nice harbor, where we very little expected anything but breakfast. But we were laden with wool. Wool must not remain in the custom house at Marseille more than 12 months at a stretch, without paying duty. It is the custom to make fictitious removals of unsold wool to evade this law, to take it somewhere when the 12 months are nearly out, bring it straight back again, and warehouse it as a new cargo for nearly 12 months longer. This wool of ours had come originally from some place in the east. It was recognized as Eastern produce the moment we entered the harbor. Accordingly, the gay little Sunday boats, full of holiday people which had come off to greet us, were warned away by the authorities. We were declared in quarantine, and a great flag was solemnly run up to the masthead on the wharf, to make it known to all the town. It was a very hot day indeed. We were unshaved, unwashed, undressed, unfed, and could hardly enjoy the absurdity of lying blistering in a lazy harbor, with the town looking on from a respectful distance, all manner of whiskered men in cocked hats discussing our fate at a remote guard-house. With gestures, we looked very hard at them, through telescopes, expressive of a week's detention at least, and nothing whatever the matter all the time. But even in this crisis the brave courier achieved a triumph. He telegraphed somebody, I saw nobody, either naturally connected with the hotel, or put en rapport with the establishment for that occasion only. The telegraph was answered, and in half an hour or less there came a loud shout from the guard-house. The captain was wanted. Everybody helped the captain into his boat. Everybody got his luggage and said we were going. The captain rowed away and disappeared behind a little jutting corner of the galley slaves' prison, and presently came back with something very sulkily. The brave courier met him at the side and received the something as its rightful owner. It was a wicker basket folded in a linen cloth, and in it were 2 great bottles of wine, a roast fowl, some salt fish chopped with garlic, a great loaf of bread, a dozen or so of peaches, and a few other trifles. When we had selected our own breakfast, the brave courier invited a chosen party to partake of these refreshments, and assured them that they need not be deterred by motives of delicacy, as he would order a second basket to be furnished at their expense, which he did no one knew how, and by, the captain being again summoned, again sulkily returned with another something, over which my popular attendant presided as before, carving with a clasp knife his own personal property, something smaller than a Roman sword. The whole party on board were made merry by these unexpected supplies, but none more so than a loquacious little Frenchman, who got drunk in 5 minutes, and a sturdy Cappuccino friar, who had taken everybody's fancy mightily, and was one of the best friars in the world, I verily believe. He had a free, open countenance, and a rich brown, flowing beard, and was a remarkably handsome man of about 50. He had come up to us early in the morning, and inquired whether we were sure to be at Nice by 11, saying that he particularly wanted to know, because if we reached it by that time he would have to perform Mass, and must deal with the consecrated wafer, fasting, whereas, if there were no chance of his being in time, he would immediately breakfast. He made this communication, under the idea that the brave courier was the captain, and indeed he looked much more like it than anybody else on board. Being assured that we should arrive in good time, he fasted and talked, fasting to everybody, with the most charming good humor, answering jokes at the expense of friars with other jokes at the expense of laymen, and saying that, friar as he was, he would engage to take up the two strongest men on board, one after the other with his teeth, and carry them along the deck. Nobody gave him the opportunity, but I dare say he could have done it, for he was a gallant, noble figure of a man, even in the cappuccino dress, which is the ugliest and most ungainly that can well be. All this had given great delight to the loquacious Frenchman, who gradually patronized the friar very much, and seemed to commiserate him as one who might have been born a Frenchman himself, but for an unfortunate destiny. Although his patronage was such as a mouse might bestow upon a lion, he had a vast opinion of its condescension, and in the warmth of that sentiment, occasionally rose on tiptoe to slap the friar on the back. When the baskets arrived, it being then too late for mass, the friar went to work bravely, eating prodigiously of the cold meat and bread, drinking deep draughts of the wine, smoking cigars, taking snuff, sustaining an uninterrupted conversation with all hands, and occasionally running to the boat's side and hailing somebody on shore with the intelligence that we must be got out of this quarantine somehow or other, as he had to take part in a great religious procession in the afternoon. After this, he would come back, laughing lustily from pure good humor, while the Frenchman wrinkled his small face into 10,000 creases, and said how droll it was, and what a brave boy was that friar. At length the heat of the sun without, and the wine within, made the Frenchman sleepy. So, in the noontide of his patronage of his gigantic protégé, he lay down among the wool and began to snore. It was 4 o'clock before we were released, and the Frenchman, dirty and woolly and snuffy, was still sleeping when the friar went ashore. As soon as we were free, we all hurried away to wash and dress, that we might make a decent appearance at the procession, and I saw no more of the Frenchman until we took up our station in the main street to see it pass, when he squeezed himself into a front place, elaborately renovated, threw back his little coat to show a broad-barred velvet waistcoat, sprinkled all over with stars, then adjusted himself and his cane so as utterly to bewilder and transfix the friar, when he should appear. The procession was a very long one, and included an immense number of people divided into small parties, each party chanting nasally, on its own account, without reference to any other, and producing a most dismal result. There were angels, crosses, virgins carried on flat boards surrounded by cupids, crowns, saints, missals, infantry, tapers, monks, nuns, relics, dignitaries of the church in green hats, walking under crimson parasols, and here and there a species of sacred street lamp hoisted on a pole. We looked out anxiously for the cappuccini, and presently their brown robes and corded girdles were seen coming on, in a body. I observed the little Frenchman chuckle over the idea that when the friar saw him in the broad-barred waistcoat, he would mentally exclaim, "Is that my patron, that distinguished man?" and would be covered with confusion. Ah, never was the Frenchman so deceived. As our friend the cappuccino advanced, with folded arms, he looked straight into the visage of the little Frenchman, with a bland, serene, composed abstraction, not to be described. There was not the faintest trace of recognition or amusement on his features, not the smallest consciousness of bread and meat, wine, snuff, or cigars. 100 est lui même, I heard the little Frenchman say in some doubt. Oh yes, it was himself. It was not his brother or his nephew, very like him. It was he. He walked in great state, being one of the superiors of the order, and looked his part to admiration. There never was anything so perfect of its kind as the contemplative way in which he allowed his placid gaze to rest on us, his late companions, as if he had never seen us in his life and didn't see us then. The Frenchman, quite humbled, took off his hat at last, but the friar still passed on, with the same imperturbable serenity, and the broad-barred waistcoat, fading into the crowd, was seen no more. The procession wound up with a discharge of musketry that shook all the windows in the town. Next afternoon we started for Genoa, by the famed Cornice road. The half-French, half-Italian vetturino, who undertook, with his little rattling carriage and pair, to convey us thither in 3 days, was a careless, good-looking fellow, whose light-heartedness and singing propensities knew no bounds as long as we went on smoothly. So long he had a word and a smile, and a flick of his whip, for all the peasant girls, and odds and ends of the sonnambula for all the echoes. So long he went jingling through every little village, with bells on his horses and rings in his ears, a very meteor of gallantry and cheerfulness. But it was highly characteristic to see him under a slight reverse of circumstances, when in one part of the journey, we came to a narrow place where a wagon had broken down and stopped up the road. His hands were twined in his hair immediately, as if a combination of all the direst accidents in life had suddenly fallen on his devoted head. He swore in French, prayed in Italian, and went up and down, beating his feet on the ground in a very ecstasy of despair. There were various carters and mule drivers assembled round the broken wagon, and at last some man of an original turn of mind proposed that a general and joint effort should be made to get things to rights again, and clear the way, an idea which I verily believe would never have presented itself to our friend, though we had remained there until now. It was done at no great cost of labor, but at every pause in the doing, his hands were wound in his hair again, as if there were no ray of hope to lighten his misery. The moment he was on his box once more, and clattering briskly downhill, he returned to the Sonnambula and the peasant girls, as if it were not in the power of misfortune to depress him. Much of the romance of the beautiful towns and villages on this beautiful road disappears when they are entered, for many of them are very miserable. The streets are narrow, dark, and dirty, the inhabitants lean and squalid, and the withered old women, with their wiry gray hair twisted up into a knot on the top of the head, like a pad to carry loads on, are so intensely ugly both along the Riviera and in Genoa too that, seen straggling about in dim doorways with their spindles or crooning together in by corners, they are like a population of witches, except that they certainly are not to be suspected of brooms or any other instrument of cleanliness. Neither are the pigskins, in common use to hold wine, and hung out in the sun in all directions, by any means ornamental, as they always preserve the form of very bloated pigs, with their heads and legs cut off, dangling upside down by their own tails. These towns, as they are seen in the approach, however, nestling, with their clustering roofs and towers, among trees on steep hillsides, or built upon the brink of noble bays, are charming. The vegetation is, everywhere, luxuriant and beautiful, and the palm tree makes a novel feature in the novel scenery. In one town, San Remo, a most extraordinary place, built on gloomy open arches, so that one might ramble underneath the whole town, there are pretty terrace gardens. In other towns, there is the clang of shipwrights' hammers and the building of small vessels on the beach. In some of the broad bays, the fleets of Europe might ride at anchor. In every case, each little group of houses presents, in the distance, some enchanting confusion of picturesque and fanciful shapes. The road itself, now high above the glittering sea which breaks against the foot of the precipice, now turning inland to sweep the shore of a bay, now crossing the stony bed of a mountain stream, now low down on the beach, now winding among riven rocks of many forms and colors, now checkered by a solitary ruined tower, one of a chain of towers built, in old time, to protect the coast from the invasions of the Barbary corsairs, presents new beauties every moment, when its own striking scenery is past, and it trails on through a long line of suburb, lying on the flat seashore to Genoa. Then, the changing glimpses of that noble city and its harbor awaken a new source of interest, freshened by every huge, unwieldy, half-inhabited old house in its outskirts, and coming to its climax when the city gate is reached, and all Genoa with its beautiful harbor and neighboring hills bursts proudly on the view.